The scream tore through the winter air, just as Reed Walker was leading his horse toward the frozen lake, and he knew before he saw her that someone had gone through the ice. January in Raton, New Mexico had brought an unusual cold snap that winter of 1883, transforming the normally placid lake on the outskirts of town into a deadly sheet of white glass. Reed dropped the reins and ran toward the sound, his boots pounding against the snow-packed ground, his breath creating clouds in the frigid air. He could see her now, a woman thrashing in the dark water, her gloved hands clawing at the ice around her, trying desperately to pull herself out, but only succeeding in breaking away more chunks of frozen surface. "Hold on!" Reed shouted, though he knew the words were inadequate. The lake had claimed 3 lives already this winter, and he would be damned if it took another. He slid to a stop at the edge of the ice, assessing the situation with the quick mind that had kept him alive through years of cattle drives and range wars. The woman was about 30 feet from shore in the deepest part of the lake where the current ran strongest beneath the deceptive surface. She had stopped screaming now, which terrified him more than the sound had. Her lips were already turning blue, her movements becoming sluggish as the cold water sapped her strength and will to fight. Reed did not hesitate. He unbuckled his gun belt and threw it aside, then grabbed a fallen branch from a nearby cottonwood tree. It was not long enough to reach her, but it might help distribute his weight as he crawled across the ice. He dropped to his stomach and began inching forward, spreading his body as flat as possible to avoid concentrating his weight in any one spot. The ice groaned beneath him, a sound like the earth itself complaining, but it held. For now. "Look at me," Reed called out when he was close enough for her to hear him clearly. "Keep your eyes on me. Do not close them." The woman's dark eyes found his, and he saw terror there, but also determination. Good. She was a fighter. Her brown hair had come loose from its pins and floated around her face like seaweed. She tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering too violently to form words. Reed could see she was wearing a heavy wool coat that had soaked through, dragging her down like an anchor. Her skirts billowed beneath the surface, waterlogged and deadly. "I am coming to get you," Reed said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "But you need to stay still. Do not thrash around." "Can you do that?" The woman managed a small nod. Reed continued his careful progress across the ice, feeling it flex and crack beneath him. Water began seeping up through the surface, soaking through his shirt and chilling him to the bone. He was close now, so close he could almost reach her. Just a few more feet. The ice gave a tremendous crack, and suddenly Reed was falling, plunging into water so cold it felt like 1,000 knives stabbing into his skin. The shock of it nearly made him gasp, which would have filled his lungs with water and killed him. He clenched his jaw and kicked hard, breaking through more ice until he reached the woman. She had gone completely still now, her body beginning to surrender to the cold. "No, you do not," Reed growled, grabbing her by the collar of her coat. "You are not dying today." He wrapped one arm around her chest and began kicking toward the edge where he had entered the water. The opening in the ice had grown larger when he fell through, which was both good and bad. Good because it gave them more room to maneuver, bad because it meant the ice was weaker than he had hoped. Reed smashed through the thin ice with his free arm, breaking a path toward the shore. Each movement was agony. His muscles were beginning to stiffen from the cold, and the woman in his arms was dead weight, unconscious now from hypothermia. His boots finally found purchase on the lake bottom, and Reed stood hauling the woman up with him. He staggered toward the shore, his legs barely cooperating, his body screaming at him to lie down and rest. But he kept moving, kept pushing forward, because stopping meant death for both of them. He collapsed on the snowy bank, still clutching the woman to his chest, both of them soaked and shivering violently. "Help!" Reed shouted, his voice hoarse. "Someone help us!" 2 men came running from the direction of town, drawn by the earlier commotion. Reed recognized them as ranch hands from the Patterson spread. They took in the situation immediately and sprang into action. One of them scooped up the unconscious woman, while the other helped Reed to his feet. Doc Morrison is in town, the first man said. We need to get them there now. They half carried, half dragged Reed and the woman to a wagon that had been parked nearby. Someone threw blankets over them, though the wool was scant protection against the cold that had seeped into their bones. The wagon lurched into motion, racing toward Raton's main street. Reed kept his hand on the woman's wrist, feeling for a pulse. It was there, faint and thready, but there. She was alive. They had made it. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Doc Morrison stripped them of their wet clothes and wrapped them in warm blankets, then placed heated stones around their bodies to drive away the cold. Reed drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of voices around him but unable to focus on the words. At some point, he heard Doc Morrison say the woman was going to live, and only then did Reed allow himself to slip into a deep, exhausted sleep. When Reed finally woke, sunlight was streaming through the window of the doctor's office. His body ached in places he did not know could ache, and his throat felt raw from the cold water. But he was alive, and according to the doc who appeared at his bedside moments later, so was the woman. She woke up about an hour ago, Doc Morrison said, checking Reed's pulse and peering into his eyes. Asking about the man who saved her. That would be you, I take it. Is she all right? Reed asked, his voice coming out as a croak. Remarkably, yes. No frostbite, no permanent damage that I can see. You got her out just in time, Reed. A few more minutes and we would be planning a funeral instead of a recovery. Doc Morrison shook his head in amazement. What possessed you to go out on that ice? You could have died. Could not just let her drown, Reed said simply. Well, you are a damn fool and a damn hero, probably in equal measure. The doc clapped him on the shoulder. Rest up today. You can see her tomorrow when you are both feeling stronger. But Reed found he could not rest. His mind kept returning to those dark eyes staring up at him through the ice, the feel of her body going limp in his arms, the desperate race against death. He had saved dozens of people over the years, pulled men from stampeding cattle, stopped bar fights before they turned deadly, even talked down a man with a gun pointed at a shopkeeper's head. But this felt different somehow. Maybe it was the intimacy of the moment, the way he had held her against his chest as he fought through the ice. Or maybe it was simply that he had come so close to failing. The next morning, Reed dressed carefully in the clean clothes someone had brought him and made his way to the room where the woman was recovering. He knocked softly on the door, suddenly nervous in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger. Come in, a voice called, clear and strong. Reed pushed open the door and found her sitting up in bed, her dark hair braided over one shoulder. Her color returned to normal. She was beautiful, he realized with a start, not in the delicate way of the saloon girls or the refined way of the banker's daughters, but in a way that spoke of strength and character. Her eyes were the color of coffee, warm and intelligent, and they fixed on him with an intensity that made his breath catch. You, she said simply, you are the one who saved me. Reed Walker, madam, he said, removing his hat. How are you feeling? Like I should be dead, but somehow am not. She gestured to the chair beside her bed. Please sit. I am Julia Price, and I owe you my life. Reed sat, turning his hat in his hands. You do not owe me anything. Anyone would have done the same. No, they would not have. Julia's voice was firm. I saw the fear in your eyes when you reached me. You knew you might die. But you came anyway. She reached out and placed her hand over his, and Reed felt a jolt of something he could not quite name run through him. Thank you does not seem adequate, but it is all I have. Thank you for my life. You are welcome, Miss Price. Reed found himself reluctant to move his hand from beneath hers. What were you doing out on the ice? Julia's expression darkened. Trying to retrieve something that belonged to my mother. I saw it glinting out there on the ice. Thought it must have fallen from my pocket the day before when I was walking by the lake. It was a locket, silver with her initials engraved on it, the only thing I have left of her. She looked away, blinking back tears. I was stupid. I knew the ice was dangerous, but I thought if I was careful, if I moved quickly, I could get it and get back to shore. Instead, I nearly died for a piece of jewelry. It was not stupid, Reed said gently. It was something precious to you. I understand that. Do you? Julia looked back at him, searching his face. My father gave me his pocket watch before he died, Reed said, pulling it from his vest. Told me to always know what time it was, to never waste a moment of the life God gave me. I have carried it every day since, through floods and fires and more than a few gunfights. So yes, I understand wanting to risk something for a memory. Julia smiled, a real smile that transformed her face. I think I like you, Reed Walker. I think I like you too, Julia Price. Doc Morrison insisted they both stay another day for observation, which gave Reed and Julia time to talk. He learned that she had come to Raton 6 months earlier from Kansas City, fleeing a disastrous engagement to a man who turned out to have a wife already. She had used her small inheritance to open a dress shop on Main Street, and against all odds, it was thriving. The women of Raton appreciated having a skilled seamstress in town, and Julia's designs were elegant without being impractical for life in the New Mexico territory. Reed told her about his life as a ranch foreman for the Webster Cattle Company, managing a spread of 3,000 acres south of town. He had been born in Texas, worked his first cattle drive at 14, and had been punching cows ever since. It was hard work, honest work, and he loved it. The freedom of the open range, the satisfaction of a job well done, the camaraderie of the men who worked beside him. But lately, he admitted, it had started to feel lonely. Most of his friends had married and started families, while Reed remained stubbornly single. Why? Julia asked. You seem like exactly the kind of man women would want to marry. Strong, brave, honest. Reed laughed. You make me sound like a prize bull at the county fair. The truth is, I never met anyone who made me want to give up my freedom. The women in town are all nice enough, but they want things I cannot give them. Fancy houses, security, a husband who comes home every night at the same time. I am a cowboy, Miss Price. My home is wherever my horse is tied, and my schedule depends on the cattle and the weather and 100 other things I cannot control. So you want a woman who can accept that life, Julia said thoughtfully. Or perhaps one who wants that life herself. Perhaps, Reed agreed, but those women are few and far between. Perhaps not as few as you think, Julia said, her eyes meeting his with an openness that made Reed's heart beat faster. When Doc Morrison finally released them both, Reed insisted on escorting Julia back to her shop. The town was buzzing with news of the rescue, and people kept stopping them on the street to congratulate Reed and welcome Julia back from the brink. Reed found himself both proud and embarrassed by the attention, but Julia handled it with grace, thanking everyone for their concern and assuring them she was fully recovered. Her shop was a small building near the center of town, with a cheerful blue door and a sign that read, Price Dressmaking, in elegant gold letters. Inside, bolts of fabric lined the walls, and a dress form stood in the corner, draped with a partially finished gown. It was a cozy space, warm and inviting, and Reed could immediately see Julia's personality reflected in every detail. Would you like some tea? Julia asked, moving toward a small stove in the back corner. I know it is not very manly, but it is all I have to offer. Tea would be fine, Reed said, though he would have preferred coffee. He watched as Julia bustled about, setting the kettle to boil and arranging cups on a small tray. She moved with efficiency and grace, and Reed found himself mesmerized by the simple domesticity of it. I have been thinking, Julia said as she poured the tea, about what you said regarding the kind of woman you need. Someone who understands the cowboy life, who does not need constant security and routine. Yes? Reed accepted the cup she offered him, their fingers brushing in a way that sent another of those strange jolts through his system. I grew up on a farm in Kansas, Julia continued. Before my father died and my mother and I moved to the city, I know what it is like to live by the seasons, to have your plans disrupted by weather or illness or any of 100 other unpredictable things. I know what it is like to work from dawn until dusk and still worry whether it will be enough. She met his eyes directly. What I am trying to say, rather poorly, is that I am not the delicate city woman you might think I am. I can handle uncertainty. I can handle a life that does not run like clockwork. Reed set down his cup carefully. Are you saying what I think you are saying? I am saying that I would like to see you again, Reed Walker. Not out of gratitude, though I am grateful, but because I enjoyed talking to you, because I felt something when you held my hand in that recovery room, and I think you felt it too. Julia's cheeks flushed pink, but she held his gaze. Am I being too forward? Doc Morrison said the cold can affect your judgment, make you feel things that are not real. Maybe that is what this is. No, Reed said firmly. He stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. This is real, Julia. I do not know what it is yet, but it is real, and I would very much like to see you again. Julia smiled, and Reed thought it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Tomorrow evening, I close the shop at 6. I will be here at 6, Reed promised. He was there at 5 minutes to 6 the next evening, freshly bathed and wearing his best shirt. Julia laughed when she opened the door and saw him standing there so precisely on time, and Reed found himself laughing too. They walked to a small restaurant on the edge of town, one of the few establishments in Raton that served decent food without also serving whiskey and women of questionable reputation. Over plates of beef and potatoes, they continued the conversation they had started in Doc Morrison's recovery room. Reed learned that Julia's father had been a dreamer, always chasing the next big opportunity, and it had gotten him killed. He died in a mining accident in Colorado, leaving Julia's mother with nothing but debts. They had moved to Kansas City, where Julia's mother took in sewing to make ends meet, teaching her daughter everything she knew about fabrics and patterns and the construction of beautiful clothes. When her mother died of pneumonia 3 years later, Julia found herself alone with a small inheritance, a set of professional skills, and a burning desire to build something of her own. The man I was engaged to, Julia said, her voice careful. He seemed perfect at first. Successful, charming, attentive. It was not until after we were engaged that I discovered he already had a wife in St. Louis. He had been traveling back and forth, maintaining 2 separate lives. When I confronted him, he laughed and said I should be grateful he was willing to keep me as his mistress. Her hands clenched around her fork. I broke off the engagement immediately and left town. I could not bear the scandal, the pitying looks, the whispers. I wanted to start over somewhere no one knew me or my shame. There is no shame in being lied to, Reed said firmly. The shame belongs to the man who deceived you. Thank you for saying that, Julia said softly. Not everyone sees it that way. Some people thought I must have known, must have been complicit somehow, as if I would willingly enter into such an arrangement. Reed reached across the table and took her hand. Anyone who knows you for 5 minutes could tell you would never do such a thing. You are honest, Julia. It shows in everything you do and say. Julia turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. You barely know me, Reed. We have spent perhaps a total of 3 hours in each other's company. Sometimes 3 hours is enough, Reed said. When I was 17, I knew within an hour of meeting my horse that we belonged together. Everyone said I was crazy, that you could not judge a horse that quickly. But I was right. Storm carried me faithfully for 15 years before he died. Sometimes you just know. Are you comparing me to your horse? Julia asked, but she was smiling. I am comparing the certainty I felt then to the certainty I feel now, Reed said. I know it is too soon to say certain things, to make certain promises, but I also know that I want to keep seeing you, to learn everything there is to know about Julia Price, if you will let me. I will let you, Julia said. They began courting in earnest after that. Reed came to town whenever his work allowed, which was more often than he had managed for any other woman. He found himself making excuses to visit Raton, inventing reasons why he needed to check on supplies or meet with his boss or handle business that could have easily been delegated to someone else. Julia would close her shop early on the days he came, and they would walk together along the creek that ran through town or sit on the bench outside her shop talking until the stars came out. Reed introduced Julia to his friends, and she charmed them all with her quick wit and genuine interest in their lives. She listened to their stories about cattle drives and bronco busting without the glazed look of boredom that usually came over women's faces during such conversations. She asked intelligent questions and seemed genuinely fascinated by the details of ranch life. When Reed invited her to visit the Webster spread, she accepted immediately. The day Reed brought Julia to the ranch, he was more nervous than he had been facing down rustlers with loaded guns. This was his world, the place where he felt most himself, and he desperately wanted her to love it as much as he did. He helped her mount a gentle mare and led her out across the rolling grassland, pointing out landmarks and explaining the workings of the ranch. Julia sat her horse well, and Reed learned she had been riding since childhood, another remnant of her farm days that she had not forgotten. They stopped on a rise overlooking the ranch headquarters, and Reed dismounted to help Julia down. She stood beside him, looking out over the landscape painted gold by the setting sun, and Reed watched her face for signs of disappointment or disapproval. Instead, he saw wonder. "It is beautiful," Julia breathed. "Reed, it is so beautiful. All that space, all that freedom. I can see why you love it." Relief flooded through Reed, followed quickly by something deeper and more profound. He turned Julia to face him, his hands on her shoulders, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "Julia, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you respond. Can you do that?" Julia nodded, her dark eyes searching his face. "I know we have only known each other for 6 weeks. I know that is not enough time by most people's standards. But I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you." Reed took a deep breath. "I love you, Julia Price. I am in love with you. And I would very much like to know if there is any chance you might feel the same way." Julia stared at him for a long moment, and Reed felt his heart drop. He had been too hasty, too impulsive. She was going to let him down gently, tell him she needed more time, that he was moving too fast. But then Julia smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I feel the same way. I love you too, Reed Walker." Reed whooped with joy and swept Julia into his arms, spinning her around until she was laughing and begging him to stop. When he finally set her down, he kissed her for the first time, a gentle, reverent kiss that tasted of hope and promise and new beginnings. Julia kissed him back with equal tenderness, her arms wrapping around his neck, and Reed knew with absolute certainty that this was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. They were married 3 months later in a small ceremony at the church in Raton. Julia wore a dress she had made herself, a simple gown of cream-colored silk that made her look like an angel. Reed wore his best suit and spent the entire ceremony grinning like a fool, unable to believe his good fortune. His friends from the ranch served as witnesses, and half the town turned out to celebrate, still viewing them as the couple brought together by tragedy and ice and impossible courage. Julia moved into the foreman's house on the Webster Ranch, a sturdy structure with 2 bedrooms and a real glass window in the parlor. She brought her sewing machine and her mother's locket, which Reed had paid 2 men to drag the frozen lake for until they found it. It hung around her neck now as she said her vows, a symbol of the past she carried with her into this new future. The first months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Julia had been independent for so long that sharing her space and her life with another person felt strange at first. Reed was used to coming and going as he pleased, answerable to no one but himself and his boss, but they worked through it with patience and humor and a determination not to let small annoyances become large problems. Julia kept her dress shop in town, writing in twice a week to meet with clients and work on orders. Reed made an effort to come home earlier in the evenings, to be present for dinner and conversation rather than working until he dropped. They learned each other's rhythms and preferences. Reed discovered that Julia was grumpy in the mornings until she had coffee, and that she liked to read before bed, often falling asleep with a book on her chest. Julia learned that Reed talked to the horses when he thought no one was listening, having full conversations with them about the weather and the cattle and whatever was on his mind. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, dreams about people he could not save, and that the best thing to do was simply hold him until the memories faded. Their first real fight came 4 months into the marriage, when Reed was late coming home from a cattle drive. Julia had prepared a special dinner for their anniversary, and she sat watching it grow cold as the hours passed and Reed did not appear. When he finally arrived near midnight, exhausted and covered in dust, he found Julia tight-lipped and furious in a way he had never seen before. "Where were you?" she demanded. "I waited for hours. I thought something had happened to you. We had a problem with some cattle breaking through a fence," Reed explained, too tired to understand the depth of her anger. "I had to stay and help fix it. It could not wait. You could not send someone to let me know? I sat here imagining you trampled or shot or lying hurt somewhere with no one to help you. After what happened at the lake, Reed, do you think I do not worry?" Julia's voice broke. "Do you think I do not remember what it felt like to watch the life draining out of me, to think I would never see another sunrise? I know how fragile life is. I need you to understand that." Reed felt his own anger rising. "I understand it, Julia. I am the one who pulled you out of that water, remember? But I cannot send a messenger every time I am running late. This is ranch life. Things happen. Emergencies come up. I thought you said you could handle that." "I can handle it," Julia shot back. "But I cannot handle being left to wonder and worry with no word from you. That is not about ranch life, Reed. That is about consideration and respect." They stared at each other, both breathing hard, both too proud and too hurt to back down. Finally, Reed sighed and rubbed his hand over his face. "You are right," he said quietly. "I should have sent word. I am sorry, Julia. I did not think about how it would feel for you, waiting and worrying. That was thoughtless of me." Julia's anger deflated as quickly as it had risen. She crossed to Reed and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his chest despite the dust and sweat. "I am sorry, too. I should not have been so harsh. I know you were not trying to hurt me. I will do better," Reed promised, holding her tight. "If I am going to be late, I will make sure you know." "You deserve that." "Thank you," Julia whispered. They made their way through that first year of marriage, learning to navigate the challenges that came with blending two independent lives into one shared existence. There were more fights, but also more laughter, more moments of perfect understanding that made all the difficulties worthwhile. Reed found himself looking forward to coming home in a way he never had before, eager to tell Julia about his day and hear about hers. Julia discovered that she loved the rhythm of ranch life, the way it connected her to the land and the seasons in a way city living never had. When Julia discovered she was pregnant, she was both thrilled and terrified. She had seen too many women die in childbirth, including her own mother, who had been weakened by years of poverty and hard work. But Reed held her and promised that everything would be fine, that he would be with her every step of the way, and Julia chose to believe him. She closed her dress shop during the last 2 months of pregnancy, much to the disappointment of her clients, but Reed insisted she rest and take care of herself. Their son was born on a cold November morning in 1884, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the entire household. Reed stood beside Julia through the long hours of labor, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, offering what comfort he could. When Doc Morrison finally placed the squirming baby in Julia's arms, Reed felt tears streaming down his face. "We have a son," Julia whispered, staring down at the tiny face with wonder. "Reed, we made a person. He is perfect, Reed said, running one finger gently down the baby's soft cheek. What should we name him? I was thinking Robert, Julia said. After my father, Robert Price Walker. Robert, Reed repeated, tasting the name. I like it. Hello, Robert. Welcome to the world, little man. Robert was a healthy baby who grew quickly, developing his father's sturdy build and his mother's dark eyes. He was a happy child, quick to smile and slow to cry, and both Reed and Julia fell completely in love with him. Reed found himself doing things he had never imagined, like pacing the floor at 3 in the morning with a fussy baby, or making silly faces to coax out a smile. Julia watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again. When Robert was 6 months old, Julia reopened her shop for limited hours, bringing the baby with her in a basket that she kept beside her sewing table. The women of Raton cooed over little Robert and brought gifts, and Julia felt blessed by the community that had welcomed her so completely. She had left Kansas City in shame and fear, certain she would never find happiness or belonging again. But here in this small New Mexico town, she had found both, along with a love deeper than she had ever imagined possible. The years passed quickly after that, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the milestones of their growing family. When Robert was 2, Julia gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, a delicate child with her father's fair hair and a will of iron. 3 years later came another son, Henry, who was as different from his older brother as night from day. Where Robert was steady and serious, Henry was impulsive and adventurous, constantly getting into trouble and making his parents laugh despite their exasperation. Reed thrived in fatherhood in a way that surprised even him. He taught Robert and Henry to ride, to rope, to read the weather and the land. He read to Margaret every night, even when he was exhausted from a long day's work, because she begged for stories, and he could not resist her. Julia watched her children grow with pride and occasional trepidation, remembering her own childhood, and determined to give them something better, something stable and full of love. The ranch prospered under Reed's management. He had a gift for working with both cattle and men, earning the respect of the ranch hands and the trust of his boss. When the owner of the Webster Cattle Company died in 1890, his will revealed that he had left a substantial portion of the ranch to Reed in gratitude for years of loyal service. Reed found himself the owner of 1,000 acres and a partner in the remaining land, a position of wealth and influence he had never sought but accepted with humility and determination to honor his benefactor's faith in him. Julia expanded her dress shop, hiring 2 assistants to help with the growing demand for her designs. She began traveling to Denver twice a year to see the latest fashions and purchase fabrics, always bringing back gifts for Reed and the children. She maintained a careful balance between her work and her family, never letting one completely overshadow the other. It was not always easy, and there were times when she felt pulled in too many directions, but she managed it with the same strength and determination she had shown that day on the ice. As their children grew older, Reed and Julia made sure they knew the story of how their parents met, though they softened some of the scarier details for young ears. They took the children to the lake every winter, showing them the spot where Julia had fallen through and explaining the importance of respecting ice and water and all the dangerous things that could seem safe on the surface. Robert listened with wide, serious eyes, while Henry looked disappointed that the story did not involve more gunfights. Margaret just held her mother's hand tighter and declared she would never, ever go on frozen lakes. The point is not to avoid danger entirely, Reed told his children on one of these visits. The point is to understand it, to respect it, and to be willing to help when someone needs you. Your mother could have died that day. I could have died trying to save her. But we did not, and because we did not, you 3 are here. Life is precious and fragile. Do not waste it, and do not stand by when you can make a difference. The children took these lessons to heart in different ways. Robert grew into a thoughtful young man who studied to become a doctor, determined to save lives the way his father had saved his mother. Henry became a lawman, driven by a desire to protect people from harm. Margaret, the youngest, became a teacher, believing that education was its own form of rescue, saving children from ignorance and limited futures. Reed and Julia watched their children leave home one by one, feeling the bittersweet ache that all parents feel when their babies become adults. The house felt too quiet without the constant noise and chaos of family life. But they had each other, just as they had started, and they found that after so many years together, they still enjoyed each other's company more than anyone else's. On their 20th anniversary, Reed took Julia back to the lake where they had met. It was January again, cold and clear, and the lake was frozen solid. They stood on the shore, hand in hand, looking out at the white expanse. "Do you ever think about that day?" Reed asked. "About how close we came to never having this life?" "All the time," Julia admitted, "especially when things are good, when I am sitting at dinner with our children, or waking up next to you in the morning. I think about how easily it could have all been taken away, how I almost lost everything before I even knew what I had to lose." "I think about it too," Reed said, "but not with regret or fear, with gratitude, because that day, as terrible as it was, brought us together. It showed me what I was capable of, what mattered most. Before you, I was just drifting through life, content, but not truly happy. You changed everything, Julia." Julia turned to face her husband, reaching up to touch his face. Time had added lines around his eyes and silver to his hair, but he was still the same man who had risked his life for a stranger, still strong and brave and infinitely good. "You changed everything for me, too. You saved my life, yes. But more than that, you gave me a reason to live it fully. You gave me love and family and a home. You gave me happiness I did not think existed." Reed kissed her then, a soft kiss full of all the years they had shared and all the years still to come. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling. "Should we go home?" Julia asked. "In a moment," Reed said. He pulled something from his pocket and held it out to her. It was a silver locket, identical to the one Julia had lost in the lake all those years ago, except this one was engraved with their initials intertwined. "I know you have your mother's locket, and I know how much it means to you. But I wanted you to have something from me, too, something to carry forward." Julia opened the locket with trembling fingers and found two tiny photographs inside. One was of Reed on their wedding day, young and happy and full of hope. The other was of herself, taken just last year, older but no less happy. "Reed, it is beautiful. Thank you." 20 years, Reed said. 20 years since I pulled you out of that water. Best decision I ever made. "Best decision we both made," Julia corrected. "I chose to fight, remember? I chose to keep my eyes open and keep breathing. We saved each other that day." Reed smiled. "You are right. We saved each other. And we have been doing it ever since, in 100 small ways every day." They walked back to their wagon, arms around each other, comfortable in the silence that came from decades of shared life. The lake lay behind them, frozen and peaceful, holding its secrets beneath the ice. But Reed and Julia carried no secrets. Their life together was an open book, written in moments of joy and struggle, laughter and tears, ordinary days, and extraordinary love. As they drove home through the winter afternoon, Julia rested her head on Reed's shoulder and thought about the journey that had brought them here, from Kansas to Raton, from loneliness to love, from a moment of near death to a lifetime of living fully. She thought about the children they had raised, the community they had built, the quiet accumulation of moments that made up a marriage. "What are you thinking about?" Reed asked, always attuned to her moods even after all these years. "How lucky we are," Julia said. "How everything had to happen exactly as it did for us to end up here, together. If I had not dropped my mother's locket, if I hadn't been foolish enough to try to retrieve it, if you had not been at the lake at exactly that moment, if you had not been brave enough to come after me. So many things that could have gone differently. But they did not," Reed said firmly. They happened exactly as they were meant to happen. I do not believe in leaving things to chance, Julia. I think some people are meant to find each other, one way or another. Maybe it would have been the lake. Maybe it would have been something else. But we would have found each other. Julia smiled, wanting to believe that, wanting to think that their love was inevitable, written in the stars, or woven into the fabric of the universe. Maybe it was romantic foolishness, but after 20 years of marriage, she thought she had earned the right to a little romantic foolishness. When they arrived home, they found a letter waiting for them from Robert. He had finished his medical training and would be returning to Raton to open his own practice. He wanted to serve the community that had raised him, to be there for the people who had welcomed his mother when she was a stranger with a scandalous past. Julia read the letter aloud to Reed, her voice thick with emotion. "He is a good man," Reed said proudly. "They all are. We did well with them, Julia." "We did," Julia agreed. "We gave them love and stability and taught them to be kind. What more can parents do?" That evening, after a simple dinner of bread and stew, Reed and Julia sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the land they now owned. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink and gold, and the air was crisp with the promise of snow. Julia wore the new locket around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her heart like a blessing. "Do you ever miss your shop?" Reed asked. "Now that you have sold it and retired?" Julia considered the question. She had sold the dress shop 2 years earlier, deciding that at 55 she wanted to spend her time on other pursuits. She volunteered at the church, helping to organize charity events and support for families in need. She had taken up painting, discovering a latent talent for capturing the landscape in watercolors, and she spent time with Reed, more time than they had been able to spend together in years, rediscovering each other now that the demands of raising children had passed. "Sometimes," Julia admitted, "I miss the creativity of it, the satisfaction of making something beautiful with my hands, but I do not miss the pressure, the deadlines, the difficult clients. This is better, I think. This is the life I always wanted but did not know how to name." "Me too," Reed said. He had handed over much of the day-to-day operation of the ranch to a younger foreman, though he still went out most days to check on things and stay connected to the work he loved. "I used to think I would work until I dropped, that I could not imagine a life without long days in the saddle. But now I find I am content with less, content with this." He gestured to encompass the porch, the land, Julia beside him. "We have earned this contentment," Julia said. "We have worked hard, raised our family, built something lasting. Now we get to enjoy it." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound carried across the empty space like a song. Julia reached for Reed's hand, and he took it, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "Reed," Julia said softly, "if you could go back to that day at the lake, knowing everything that would come after, would you still dive in? Would you still risk everything for a stranger?" Reed did not hesitate. "Without question, 1,000 times over, I would make the same choice, because that stranger became my wife, the mother of my children, my best friend. That stranger became my whole world. So yes, I would risk everything again, gladly." Julia felt tears prick her eyes. After all these years, Reed could still make her cry with his honesty and his love. "I would choose to go out on that ice again, too, knowing what was waiting on the other side. Even knowing the fear and the cold and the certainty I was going to die, I would do it, because it brought me to you." "We are quite a pair," Reed said with a chuckle, "both of us willing to court death for love." "Is that not what love is, though?" Julia asked. "A willingness to risk everything for another person? To put their needs and safety above your own?" "You taught me that, Reed. You showed me what real love looks like." "You taught me just as much," Reed countered. "You taught me that love is not just the big dramatic gestures. It is showing up every day. It is forgiveness and patience and choosing to stay even when things are hard. You could have left a dozen times over the years when I was stubborn or thoughtless or too wrapped up in work, but you stayed. You chose us again and again, and I will keep choosing us, Julia promised, for as long as we have. They went inside as the temperature dropped and the stars grew brighter overhead. Reed built up the fire while Julia made tea, and they settled into their chairs with books and blankets, reading in companionable silence until they grew sleepy. It was such an ordinary evening, the kind they had shared hundreds of times before, but Julia recognized it for what it was: precious, perfect, exactly the life she wanted. In bed that night, Julia lay with her head on Reed's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. That heart had kept beating through the freezing water, through the exhausting swim to shore, through 20 years of hard work and joy and sorrow and everything that made up a life. She pressed a kiss over his heart, a silent thank you for all that it had given her. "I love you," Reed murmured, his voice drowsy. "My brave, beautiful Julia." "I love you too," Julia whispered back. "My hero, my husband, my home." They fell asleep that way, wrapped around each other, warm and safe and utterly content. Outside, the winter wind blew across the New Mexico landscape, rattling the windows and whistling under the eaves. But inside the house Reed and Julia had built together, all was peaceful and warm. The years continued to pass, marked by the return of their children with families of their own. Robert married a nurse from Denver and had 3 daughters who adored their grandmother and begged for stories about the olden days. Henry married a fellow lawman, a tough woman who could outshoot most men and who fit perfectly into the family. Margaret brought home a school teacher from Santa Fe, and they settled in Raton to raise their 2 sons. Reed and Julia found themselves grandparents 7 times over, and they took to the role with enthusiasm. Their house became the gathering place for the family, especially during holidays when everyone would crowd in, filling the rooms with noise and laughter and love. Julia taught her granddaughters to sew, passing on the skills her mother had taught her. Reed taught the grandsons to ride, telling them stories about the old days and making them promise to be brave and kind. On their 30th anniversary, the entire family gathered at the lake for a picnic. It was summer this time, the water sparkling blue under a cloudless sky, with no hint of the danger it had once posed. The grandchildren played at the water's edge under the watchful eyes of their parents, while Reed and Julia sat on a blanket, surveying their legacy. 30 years, Julia marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like forever. Both, Reed agreed. That is how you know it is real, I think. When time can feel like everything and nothing all at once. Robert approached them, carrying his youngest daughter on his shoulders. "Mother, Father, we wanted to do something special for your anniversary. We commissioned something and just picked it up from the craftsman in town." He gestured, and Henry came forward carrying a wooden sign. The sign was beautifully carved from thick oak with letters painted gold. It read, "Walker's Lake, named in honor of Reed and Julia Walker, whose love story began here in January 1883. May all who visit these shores remember that from moments of fear and danger can come lifetimes of love." Julia burst into tears, and Reed blinked hard, overcome with emotion. Their children had convinced the town council to officially rename the lake, ensuring that their story would not be forgotten. It was more than they deserved, more than they had ever expected. "Thank you," Reed managed to say. "All of you. This is extraordinary." "You are extraordinary," Margaret said, coming to hug them both. "You taught us what love looks like, what it means to build a life with another person. This is the least we could do to honor that." The sign was installed at the edge of the lake, where it would greet all visitors. The town threw a party to celebrate, and Reed and Julia found themselves once again at the center of attention, telling their story to a new generation who had not heard it before. They spoke of fear and courage, of chance and choice, of the moment when two lives collided and changed each other forever. As the party wound down and the sun began to set, Reed walked Julia down to the water's edge. The lake was calm and peaceful, reflecting the pink and orange sky like a mirror. They stood together, arms around each other, looking out at the water that had nearly taken Julia's life and had ultimately given them both so much more. "No regrets?" Reed asked, his voice gentle. "Not a single one," Julia replied. "Every moment, good and bad, led us here. How could I regret any of it? Even the hard times, the fights and the struggles, and all the moments when we did not understand each other? Especially those," Julia said. "Those are the moments that taught us how to love better, how to be better partners. Without them, we would not appreciate the good times as much. We need both, the ice and the warmth, to make a complete life." Reed kissed her temple, a gesture of affection and respect and enduring love. "You are wiser than I am." "No, just more willing to admit it when I am wrong," Julia teased, and Reed laughed, the sound carrying across the water. They stood there until the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. Their grandchildren were being rounded up by their parents, protesting that they were not tired and could stay up forever. Reed and Julia exchanged knowing looks, remembering when their own children had made the same protests. The cycle of life continued, generation after generation, and they were grateful to have been a part of it. As they walked back to their wagon, Julia saw the sign with their names on it and felt a swell of pride and humility. They had not set out to be remembered, had not tried to create some great legacy. They had simply loved each other as best they could, day after day, year after year, and somehow that had been enough, more than enough. The final years of their lives passed quietly and peacefully. Reed's health began to decline when he was 72, his body finally showing the wear of decades of hard physical work. Julia nursed him with the same devotion he had shown her so many years ago, refusing to let anyone else take over his care. She read to him when his eyes grew tired, held his hand when the pain was bad, and sat with him through the long nights when sleep would not come. "I am not afraid," Reed told her one night, as they lay together in the darkness. "I have had a good life, Julia. Better than I deserved. I have loved and been loved. I have seen my children grow into good people. I have done work that mattered. What more could a man ask for?" "More time," Julia said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "I want more time with you, Reed. 35 years is not enough. 50 would not be enough. I want forever. You will have forever," Reed promised. "I will be waiting for you on the other side. And until then, I will be in every sunset you watch, every bird that sings outside your window, every beat of your heart. Death cannot separate us, Julia. Love is stronger than that." Julia wanted to believe him, but the fear of losing him was overwhelming. She clung to him, memorizing the feel of his body against hers, the sound of his breathing, the scent of his skin. She tried to press every detail into her memory, terrified that she would forget some small thing that made him uniquely Reed. Reed Walker died on a warm spring morning with his wife holding his hand and his children gathered around his bed. His last words were, "Thank you for a beautiful life." He closed his eyes and slipped away peacefully, and Julia felt a piece of her own soul go with him. The grief was enormous, a crushing weight that threatened to pull Julia under, just as surely as the frozen lake had all those years ago. But just as she had fought to survive then, she fought to survive now. She owed it to Reed to live fully, to honor the life they had built together by continuing to be part of the world. So she got up every morning, even when she did not want to. She ate, even when food tasted like ashes. She accepted the comfort of her children and grandchildren, even when she wanted to push everyone away and wallow in her sorrow. Slowly, painfully, the grief became bearable. It never disappeared, but it softened around the edges, making room for happy memories and gratitude for all they had shared. Julia found herself able to smile when she thought of Reed, to laugh at memories of his stubborn streak or his terrible singing voice. She began to live again, not just exist. She spent her remaining years surrounded by family, sharing stories of Reed and their life together. She made sure the grandchildren knew their grandfather, not as a distant memory, but as a real person with flaws and strengths and a great capacity for love. She showed them the locket Reed had given her, now containing a photo of him and worn smooth from decades of her touching it for comfort. On what would have been their 40th anniversary, Julia's children took her to the lake. She stood before the sign bearing their names, looking out at water that sparkled in the January sun. Ice had formed along the edges, but the center remained open, dark and mysterious. "He saved me twice," Julia told her children. "Once from the ice, and once from a life of loneliness and fear. I was so broken when I came to Raton, so certain I would never trust or love again. And then Reed appeared, willing to risk everything for a stranger. That act of courage changed both our lives. It gave us each other, and it gave you, all of you. Never forget that love is worth the risk. Always." Julia Price Walker lived to be 82 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. She remained sharp and engaged until the end, still sewing, still painting, still telling stories about the cowboy who had pulled her from an icy grave and into a life more wonderful than she had ever imagined possible. When she died peacefully in her sleep, her family found her wearing the locket Reed had given her, clutching it over her heart. They buried her next to Reed under a cottonwood tree on the ranch they had built together. The headstone was simple granite with both their names and the inscription, "Two souls saved by courage and bound by love, together again forever." The lake still bears their name, a testament to a love story that began with near tragedy and ended with triumph. Visitors come from all over to see Walker's Lake, to stand where Reed and Julia stood, and imagine what it must have been like on that cold January day in 1883 when a cowboy became a hero and a drowning woman became a bride. The sign remains, weathered now, but still legible, reminding everyone who reads it that the greatest love stories often begin in the most unexpected ways. And if you visit the lake on a quiet evening as the sun is setting, some say you can see two figures standing on the shore, arms around each other, looking out at the water that brought them together. Whether it is merely a trick of the light or something more, no one can say for certain. But the people of Raton like to believe that Reed and Julia are still there, still together, still celebrating the love that death could not destroy. Their descendants still live in and around Raton, carrying forward the values Reed and Julia instilled in their children. They tell the story to each new generation, making sure it is never forgotten. They speak of courage and love, of second chances, and the importance of taking risks for the things that matter most. They speak of a cowboy who saw someone in need and did not hesitate, and a woman who fought to survive and found more than survival on the other side. The story of Reed and Julia Walker became woven into the fabric of Raton itself, a founding myth that spoke to the town's values and character. Schools taught it as an example of bravery and compassion. The church used it in sermons about love and sacrifice. Parents told it to children as a bedtime story, though they still softened the scarier parts about the ice and the drowning. Walker's Lake became a popular destination, especially for young couples who would come to have their photographs taken by the sign, hoping some of Reed and Julia's legendary love would rub off on them. Marriage proposals happened there regularly, with nervous young men dropping to one knee on the very spot where Reed had pulled Julia from the water. It became a place of romance and hope, a reminder that beautiful things could emerge from terrible circumstances. The dress shop Julia had founded continued under new ownership, still using some of her original designs and techniques. A small museum in town dedicated a room to Reed and Julia, displaying Julia's wedding dress, Reed's pocket watch, photos of the family, and a detailed account of the rescue that had started it all. School children visited on field trips, staring wide-eyed at the artifacts and trying to imagine what it must have been like. The ranch Reed had helped build continued to thrive, eventually being passed down through the family. His great-grandson ran it now, using modern techniques but still honoring the principles Reed had established. Treat the land with respect. Treat your workers with fairness and always put family first. The foreman's house where Reed and Julia had raised their children still stood, now a historical landmark that visitors could tour. But more than the physical reminders, it was the story itself that endured. The story of how one moment of courage could change everything. How love could bloom in the aftermath of tragedy. How two broken people could come together and create something whole and beautiful and lasting. It was a story Raton needed, especially in hard times, because it reminded people that hope was always possible, that second chances existed, that taking a risk for another person was never wasted. And so the legacy of Reed and Julia Walker lived on, not just in their descendants or the places that bore their names, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who heard their story and believed in the possibility of love conquering fear, of courage triumphing over danger, of two souls finding each other against all odds and holding on with everything they had. It was a story that transcended time and place, speaking to something fundamental in the human experience: the need to be saved and the desire to save others, the terror of loss and the joy of being found, the simple truth that we are all stronger together than we could ever be alone. Raton changed over the years, growing from a small frontier town into a bustling modern community. But no matter how much changed, the story of Reed and Julia remained constant, a touchstone that connected past to present, a reminder of who the town had been and who it still wanted to be. And that perhaps was their greatest legacy. Not just the family they created or the businesses they built, but the example they set of what it meant to truly love another person with everything you had, to fight for that love every single day, and to create from it something that would outlast your own mortal life. In the end, Reed and Julia's story was not just about a dramatic rescue or a fairy tale romance. It was about the choice to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. It was about seeing someone in need and choosing to act rather than turn away. It was about taking broken pieces and carefully, patiently, building them into something new and whole. It was about everyday courage and everyday love, the kind that shows up morning after morning and chooses partnership over independence, vulnerability over safety, connection over solitude. It was a story that would be told as long as Raton existed, passed down through generations like a precious heirloom. And every time someone stood by Walker's Lake and looked out at the water, they would remember that on a cold January day in 1883, a cowboy named Reed Walker dove into freezing water to save a woman named Julia Price, and in doing so, saved them both. They would remember that from that one act of courage came decades of love, a family that spanned generations, and a legacy that would never be forgotten. They would remember that the best love stories are not the ones without struggle or pain, but the ones where two people choose each other again and again, through ice and fire, through fear and joy, through every season of life until death finally parts them and they meet again in whatever lies beyond.